now for the main event. So Chris Keathley is joining us today to talk about telemetry. Chris probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Y'all know him in the community. He's on Elixir Outlaws. You've heard him talk and rant about many things via the podcast, and it's always fun to listen to him. So without further ado, take it away, Chris.
All right, cool. Thank you. Yeah, that's actually my MO these days is a lot of people say my name and then the word rant after it, which I don't know how to feel about that. Yeah, there's an Elixir. So that's actually the thing. So I have a podcast. I think if you have a podcast, you're morally obligated to tell people that you have a podcast when you meet them. Thought about changing my Twitter bio. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about telemetry. We're actually going to talk about telemetry because when we were talking about different talks that would be interesting, I said I can either talk about telemetry or I can explain some vague thoughts I have about why business logic isn't a real thing and why MVC is a bad pattern and why the layers that we use to build systems are fundamentally flawed. But it's up to you. And Johnson was like, let's go with the first one. That sounds more useful. So we're going to talk about telemetry stuff. So this is kind of all loosely based on a blog post that I wrote a little bit ago. I recently have been working on building out some monitoring tooling for Bleacher Report, which is where I work. And we've been trying to sort of consolidate how we do monitoring, how we do alerting, and all those sorts of things. And as part of doing that, we've learned a lot and been pretty semi-involved in the telemetry project and like kind of practices around telemetry and those sorts of things. And so a lot of this talk is sort of motivated by that. That said, because this is like a different environment, this isn't like a normal meetup talk or like, this is like we're all just sitting at our computers and stuff like that. Definitely interrupt me. I would rather this be more of a discussion about some of these things. So if you have thoughts about it, let me know. Let's do this. Oh, and now we navigate the like complex waters of how do I present things? Present a window. Yes, allow it though. Oh, I see. Come on. Okay, but please though. But Firefox, come on. Firefox, you can do this. Firefox actually may not be able to do this. This is hilarious. It literally, I cannot click the allow button. Wow.
What are you trying to do? You're trying to...
I'm literally just trying to share the screen. Is this literally not a thing that Firefox can? It's literally not a thing Firefox can do. Like the allow button doesn't work. Hang on. I'm going to refresh.
Could be one of those things where Google's trying to say, use our product or get out,
Yeah, I was going to say, that sounds like an antitrust lawsuit waiting to happen right there.
Yeah.
I've never had Google Meet not crap out on anything. So
yeah, but how are you going to?
I don't know. They're very particular about.
But James, how are you going to find a lawyer to take up your antitrust lawsuit if you can't Google them?
That's a good point.
Allow me to direct you to the best legal advice.
Yes. They're playing the long game. I see. Yeah.
Like, why is every lawyer I contact tells me I have no case at all? There we go. We're seeing a screen.
You're muted, Chris.
You get one
All
of
right. How about now?
Screen share.
Anything?
Yep.
All right, cool. Right on. So we're just going to roll with this. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about telemetry stuff. So first, some motivation. You got this, Chris. You can do this. All right, so let's figure out what we're going to talk about. So today we're going to talk about how telemetry works. Very, very briefly, how telemetry works. We're talking about telemetry as an API. We'll talk a little bit about spans, using metadata, and then finally some hot takes because that's my brand. So how does telemetry work? Hopefully everybody's already familiar with this stuff, so this will kind of be a refresher. If not, that's totally cool. When you want to emit telemetry events, you simply call execute on the telemetry library. And what this does is essentially loops through stuff that's in ETS. It does it really quickly, and it just does a bunch of pattern matches on things. And so what you do when you actually call this is you give it some sort of name, and typically this name is actually a list of atoms. And this allows you to sort of prefix all the events that you're going to emit with either your library name, your application name, or some other relevant signature. You can include measurements, which I believe now have to be a map. And often you want a map anyway. We'll talk a little bit about the kinds of stuff you can put into measurements. And finally, you put metadata. And metadata is all the other stuff that goes around your call. So the thing that you're actually trying to trace, the thing that you're trying to determine, how long it takes to understand what the, different characteristics of your system, all that stuff goes inside of the metadata, and you're able to do stuff with it, right? So fairly simply, you can just use this one library and just emit stuff. And the cool thing is that it's decoupled from anything else. Like, you don't care about who consumes this. You just have to emit events. And as long as you're emitting events, anybody can hook in and listen to those events. And it works across Erlang because it uses Erlang as a base language. So we can use it in Elixir really easily. And everybody else in the sort of the Beam ecosystem can use this stuff really easily. And it's become a real standard for how we talk about doing telemetry, which is cool. It's cool that we have this as a standard because it means that the rest of our tooling around it can also become standard, and we can get a bunch of leverage out of that. So in order to hook into these events, you can you use the attach mini function. So when you use attach, there's attach mini. Typically attach mini, in my experience, I use more than attach, but whatever. Your mileage may vary on all that stuff. But in any case, you can attach to different events. There's a couple different ways to do it. And when you do that, you give this specific thing a name of some sort, and then you say what events you actually want to listen to. So in this case, I'm using Finch, which is an HTTP library that I'm working on with some other people. And in this case, we're just listening to all the different events that Finch emits. We'll talk a little bit more about what these events actually mean as we go. But you just say what the events you want to listen to are. And then you say what module you're going to use to handle each event. So in this case, I'm saying use the current module that I'm in, but you could point this at anything. You can actually just pass it a function. You can do whatever you want here. And that flexibility is really useful because it means that you can use telemetry in a whole host of situations. I was actually talking to Brian about this the other day, but he was saying that he uses telemetry when debugging systems, like live running systems, to figure out what calls are being made or what's going on, to get more insight into those sorts of things. And there's tons of tools you could use. You could use Recon Trace or all these other things, but it's a flexible tool that you can use in a wide variety of situations. And then finally, it's important to note that when this function gets executed, it's actually being executed. The event is being sort of handled in the calling process. So there's no crossing the boundary, as it were, the process boundary, when you call this function. It's actually being executed in the caller. And that's really important for a bunch of reasons because it enables a bunch of other facilities. It also makes calling it really pretty inexpensive because you're just calling a function at that point. You don't have to like copy memory anywhere. So all that means these are all good choices. These are all things to be aware of, though, because I don't think that everybody fully necessarily always realizes that this is actually the execution model when it comes to telemetry. So that was a little bit about how telemetry actually works. So let's talk about using like what it means to have telemetry as an API and to treat it like an API. So as we said before, when we want to execute an event, we give it some sort of name, which is really a list with atoms. We give it a set of measurements and a set of metadata. And it's really important to note that this is an API at this point. This is a set of things, a contract that you're agreeing to with all of your users. Anybody who uses your library has to be able to respect this, has to be able to believe in this, to trust that this is going to be what you're going to provide, what you say you're going to provide. Because at the end of the day, they're actually going to build tooling for their running application that's super important to them. This is potentially the most important. This is actually, I'm going to argue that this API is more important than the docs that you write for all your functions. And so because of that, it's really, really important that you don't break this API. And this is a thing that I think people forget a lot when they're working in telemetry, is that it's sort of this, it feels like a secondary thing. It feels like it doesn't matter as much that you broke your telemetry API, when in fact, I'm going to argue that it matters more. And the reason is simply because if you were to break a function, like you have some obvious function call that you make, and if you break it, well, the odds are that you've annoyed your user, but they probably found it in development or test. They didn't find it when they went into production, probably. If you break telemetry, it's almost guaranteed that you're going to break them in production, and they're not going to know that they're broken until they've deployed it and they're actually out there running and trying to figure out what's going on. So it's really critical that you don't do this to your users if you can avoid it at all. There's a bunch of ways that you can break your API. There's the obvious ones in terms of returning different measurements or different metadata that your users may have come to expect you to return. But there's another more subtle one, and that is the actual names of the telemetry events that you use. And there's a pattern that's emerged, which I think is really net negative for the community. And it's this pattern wherein you actually allow users to change the name in some way. So often you'll see this as like a prefix that happens, and users will change this. And certain very popular libraries, Ecto, Plug, Phoenix, all do this. And it's really net negative because it means you can't build automated tooling around any of this stuff. And that's a real shame, because it means that none of that stuff's automatic anymore. So you don't actually really want to do this. This is not a real thing that you want to do. The other really big part about this being an API is, like all good APIs, it does need docs. So this is, I guess, a bit of a humble brag because this is from Finch's documentation, but it's really important that when you have these events, you put them somewhere and you say exactly what you're going to be returning. And in all reality, like, this is not really even complete enough. I think you should be adding a lot more information about in what context these things get called. Can calls be nested underneath each other and those sorts of things? And this all really matters in terms of providing something that's really usable to the end user. The other big one, and this is kind of just, again, thinking about what it means for a user to be able to not have to think about this stuff, to be able to really trust all these things, is you need to be really good about specifying all your units. Like, so for instance, we might return a set of measurements that's like a duration, and the duration is 1,000. But it's like 1,000 of what? Like 1,000 parsecs? Like, that's not even a measurement of time. Like how does this, how does this all work? So in general, we're going to assume that they're native units, and you'll convert them using system.convert time unit or whatever that function call is. But if you don't want to do this, like if you want to be more specific, or you don't want to use native units, then you need to wrap it in a tuple and actually say, like, there's 1,000 and then the unit that you're talking in. And this can be useful too for other measurements, like bytes, for instance. You might assume bytes, but you're returning something else. So it's always just good to be explicit, or to have a pretty reasonable conventional default. And for durations, it's native units. But it's always good to sort of be explicit about that stuff. The cool thing is, if we do all this, and if everybody gets really good at this, then it enables tooling like this. So this is something we've built at Bleacher Report. When you want to add time series data and tracing, we use Datadog's APM stuff. When you want to add that, this is all you do. You just set up, we have a tool called Hertz. You say what the name of your service is or your app or whatever, and you start it as part of your supervision tree, and you give it a list of monitors, and it just hooks it all up and does it all for you. What's even cooler is because, you know, we've written this and it's conventional for us, we actually could do something even more clever and look at all the loaded applications, and any of them that we have monitors for, we could just install. Unfortunately, we can't do that because certain libraries that I won't name, but they're very popular, don't allow us to do this because they require all this configuration, and they don't have a steady contract about what it is that they're returning. All right, so that was telemetry as an API. So let's talk a little bit about spans. All right, so for a long time when people were starting to use telemetry, there was a lot of different ways in which people sort of returned events and tried to provide good measurements for everything. And the pattern that's quickly emerged, and it's emerged also based on input from other sort of tooling that exists out there in the world, is this notion of a span. And a span is actually pretty, it's not overly complicated. The big idea is that if you have some function call that's going to take some amount of time, when you start the function call, as soon as you can, you emit a start event. And that start event, you know, is the function call name start. And it provides a set of measurements and metadata. And at the end, when you're done, you emit a stop event. And the stop event is going to include additional information like how long this thing took to execute, and any sort of relevant, measurement or metadata that might have happened as a part of calling this function. So maybe the result. You might return errors if there was an error in the middle of it. And if something explodes in the middle, for instance, you throw or you raise an exception, you emit a exception event. And that will also include a duration, but it also includes things like the kind of error and the stack trace. And that allows tooling to kind of hook into these disparate events. So like I said, so you provide these different, different measurements and metadata as you do this. There is a standard around this. I'm not going to go into what the conventions are around all this stuff necessarily, because it's slightly boring. But you provide all this like standard information when you do this. And what's interesting is like when you do this, now you can support tons of use cases. I'm going to go out on a limb and say you can probably support 90+% of all use cases with those 3 events, just by providing those 3 those pieces. So, because if you think about it, if all you want to do is emit time series, well, all you need to do is listen to stop and exception events. And now you can get all your histograms and measurements around how long, your 95th, 99th percentiles and those sorts of things. If you want to do tracing, well, now you have a start and stop event that you can open spans and close spans, open traces, close traces, and add errors to your traces and all that sort of stuff. Like you have all the information you need now to do this. And it provides a lot of flexibility for users to do and for people building tooling to do whatever it is that they need to do to get that information out. You can start doing logging. You can do all these kinds of cool things. So that's spans. We're going to go slightly, we're going to go into metadata next. So the big thing about metadata, and it's something that I didn't quite understand when I was first getting started, and I don't think it's something that people take full advantage of now, but you really want to include basically everything relevant to the call. And you just want to throw it in metadata, because you can almost never have enough metadata, because you can never quite anticipate what all the callers want to do with your telemetry events that you're emitting. They're always going to come up with something more interesting for you to be able to take advantage of, or for them to be able to take advantage of. So you want to just basically throw all of it, anything relevant to that call, throw it into metadata, and then emit that. The other reason that that's okay to do is, again, because you're executing the function in the calling process. So you're not copying all this data anywhere. You're just calling a function. And because of that, it's pretty inexpensive. I mean, it's basically free in as much as anything is, calling a function is free. To just throw all that stuff in there. And you just should. The other really important thing is that it's totally reasonable to allow the user to add additional metadata. And you can do something as simple as this. You can, build the metadata that you're gonna emit, and then just allow the user to toss additional stuff onto there. And that allows them to add more context to how that call is being used. If you imagine you've got some RPC that you're making, that might have a bunch of metadata about that RPC, but maybe the user wants to add additional stuff about where it was called from and just get that information as a log or something like that. They can now do that if you just provide this additional metadata for them and allow them just to kind of toss whatever it is they want on there. All right. So we're reasoning right through this. We'll talk a little bit about just some opinions, and then we'll kind of wrap up a little bit. And I'm happy to discuss some of this stuff. So this one is slightly controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and say I don't actually think you want to make telemetry optional. A lot of libraries that are out there allow you to sort of opt in to telemetry, and I think that this is actually kind of a bad pattern. Because at the end of the day, executing a specific telemetry event, if no one's listening to it, doesn't do anything. It's not this huge expensive thing that's happening, and so it's not a thing that you need users to sort of opt into. You should just do this as part of your library. When at the entry to your library, emit events, emit a start event, and then emit a stop event when they leave your function call. And if no one's listening, no one's listening. But if people want to take advantage of it, they can. And this goes into the next point that I want to make, which is that don't use middleware to plug telemetry into your library. I'm not anti-middleware. Middleware is fine, but you should not make users have to add a middleware somewhere in order just to add telemetry. And I think this has become common simply because of some of the patterns that have emerged, but I don't actually think you want this. You don't want it because you necessarily aren't capturing the full thing when you use a middleware. The other thing is you don't know how the user used your middleware. And it's entirely possible that they're using it incorrectly and they're not wrapping the sum total of all the things that they actually want to get telemetry around. They're not capturing the full duration of time. And so I just don't think you actually want to do this. And there's way more use cases where your user can just use this incorrectly now. And I don't think that that's a good pattern. I don't think that's a thing that you really want to force upon your users. That's not a good user experience for them. So, and then the final thing is, I think we want to be, generally speaking, lifting telemetry up as high into the call stack as possible. So if you do that, it's my experience that if you can do that, it makes adding relevant metadata much easier. It makes capturing the full set of operations that your library is actually doing much easier. And it keeps things nice and sort of, it keeps things much easier to understand. And it allows your library to not be as coupled to those events. Because again, the events are a contract. How you emit those events, when you emit those events are a contract that you're agreeing to. And so if you can kind of move those to the edges as much as you can, then it makes it easier for you to change stuff in the future. And then the final thing I just wanted to throw out there was just, I would really work to treat your telemetry events the same way you would documentation or tests. Treat them with the same care, and by that I mean have them in the first place. Do all this good stuff. But I think Elixir, the Elixir community, we take a lot of pride in having good docs, having tests around our libraries, all these good things, and I want to see telemetry become similar to that, where we take a lot of pride in the fact that we have this way of managing events and managing telemetry stuff that like the entire ecosystem uses, because that's really cool. It's like a really it's a really nice sort of badge of honor to have that, like, we care about this, and it shows newcomers to the language and pragmatists who might want to adopt Elixir that we like take this stuff really seriously. So that's what I had officially. And I'm happy to discuss any of this, or like take questions, or have a conversation about any of these things that y'all are interested in. And Brian can tell me all the things I got wrong.
Well, how do we jump in here? You just start talking?
Go for it.
All right. Hey, Chris. Mark Windholtz here. What I've seen a number of talks at Lone Star and this about telemetry, and I guess I just haven't been at the stage of maturity of a project that did something with it. Okay, we put these things in there. What good stuff comes out the other end? How do we get that good stuff out of there?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the use case, right? If you're building an app, like if you're building like a fully featured app for someone, you may not get a lot of benefit out of using telemetry in your application, depending on depending on the method by which you get metrics. This is all predicated on the idea that getting metrics out of your app matters. And for certain applications at certain stages, it may not matter. That's like if you're building like a brand new greenfield thing, and you're on like a 3-month engagement with them, and they just want to see if they have market fit, like maybe you don't care. You know what I mean? And I've definitely worked on those kinds of projects. I think where this matters is specifically for libraries, people building libraries and working on this stuff. I think it matters for finding a good patterns that are reusable across the ecosystem. Those are huge benefits for those of us who rely on a lot of these libraries, right? I have 40 services that I need to be able to add like a single library to and get metrics out of them like pretty quickly. Right now it's actually like kind of okay. It's like getting better as people are slowly moving to these conventions.
So in the handlers, you say they're free, but if the handler has to do something with that data, like if it inserts it in a database, well, that's not free anymore.
Right. Yeah,
So how do you keep it? How do you keep it free?
Oh, you can't. That's
Okay.
I mean, it's just not a thing. Like you can't. You know what I mean? In as much as like you have to do some work. There's some reason that you're attaching it, right? So you're either shoving it through StatsD or Prometheus or tracing, and all those things have costs associated with them. It's free in as much as you don't have to cross the process boundary necessarily. You might have to, depending on what you do inside the handler, but just executing it, the event, you don't cross the process boundary.
So you have a story of a big win that like you did some metrics and something really got clear and you changed something?
Oh yeah. I mean, like for us, and I know Greg could talk about this even more than I can. So we've invested like pretty heavily in tracing and making sure that we have tracing that works across from like the front door API all the way through the system. So you can actually see a request come into the front door and actually look at all the calls it's making down to the database 3 services later. And you can see the query that executed and how long that query took. And you can start to figure out like if nothing else, you get like a gestalt for like what the service looks like what the system looks like, what the profiles are, like how long things tend to take. You get like a kind of feel. It's like a living thing. Like it's like an organism. Like you get a feel for what that is. But beyond that, like when you're debugging something, you can literally start to say like, okay, here's the error. It's originating from this call, and it's happening because this database is offline over here or whatever. Like you can start to figure out like all that stuff. So those are huge wins for us. That's not necessarily powered exactly by telemetry, but it's been greatly helped by the fact that people are sort of adopting these conventions, because it's made it really trivial for us to start adding traces around new libraries and new things and get more and more visibility into the system.
So do you have a situation that tells you, okay, now we have to look at our telemetry. Now we have to add more telemetry, because is it, hey, things are really too slow and we don't know why, let's add the telemetry? Or what are the triggers for knowing that you need it? You know?
That's a great question. I think it's actually like, every company's going to be different. For us, Greg is going to laugh at what I'm going to say, because it's more like we strive for this more than it is like the world that we live in. But ideally speaking, you have SLOs, like you have objectives for each of your services. Those objectives need to be things that you hit, and you need to alert if you're going to be in violation of those. So for instance, you might say that we're going to have 99% uptime, and uptime meaning like successful requests divided by total requests. Like we're going to have 99% uptime, and our 99th percentile is going to be under 200 milliseconds. I'm making numbers up. Like you have that as an objective. That objective is driven by the fact that if we don't serve that traffic to these clients that quickly, they leave the site. You drive that via some sort of like heuristic, like important thing that matters to your users. And then if you start to violate that, you start to raise alarms, and you start to ping on call, and you start to be like, okay, we got to figure out why we're not meeting these objectives anymore. Because those are the things that are important. That's the ideal, and I think that's the ideal for, I think a lot of companies are striving for that. I actually think very few sort of get to that, because they just don't have the people power to do it to a certain level of like rigor. But that's the goal.
Thanks. That's cool.
So are you guys using, I guess, the StatsD reporter and the Datadog formatter for telemetry?
Yeah, Greg wrote it. So like,
cool.
Not the StatsD one, but the Datadog like APM one. Yeah, we use that.
Zach Daniel wrote it, to be fair. I became a co-contributor, and I wrote a lot of stuff for it.
Very cool.
So yeah, so we use statics under the hood, which I think we're using our fork of it at this point. I think everybody's got a fork of statics at this point that they maintain, is my feeling on it. But yeah.
So Chris, you mentioned, documentation like as a first class. And one of the things that I was started thinking about as you were putting up like examples of how like a telemetry execute event is just structured, and how the community has sort of started to come together on standards, some of them good, some of them maybe not so good. Do you know, or does anybody heard about taking that consensus that's starting to come together and maybe automatically generating some of that documentation for a library, the way that you compile your app, you push it to hex, and you've already got this auto-generated like pre-formatted code blocks that call out, this is my function, these are my declared types, just by virtue of parsing the structure of the source code. If there's anything like that for telemetry events and pulling them out so that you're not manually writing markdown, and take that out of the library implementer's hands altogether. If they've chosen to implement telemetry, then we'll do the rest for you automatically and make it that much more painless.
Yeah, so that's actually the telemetry registry, which just released officially about a week ago. So it's been an experimental thing for a while, but that is official now. So that codifies essentially. So yeah, when we say on settling around conventions, so the way we've settled on these conventions is essentially like Greg and I and everybody else, like
through fiat.
we
Like,
we literally like are like writing everything in the telemetry space and then using it at work and then figuring out like, oh, this works and this doesn't. And so we're kind of at a place now where like a lot of things that Chris highlighted as far as like naming and everything else are now quote unquote official doctrine. So if you're not doing it that way, then you're working against us. Because essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to like there's the base level tooling like registering telemetry events and stuff.
Mm.
And then there's everything else like on top of that that we're trying to build on top of that. So for instance, everything in the open telemetry space, like there's a lot that we're trying to do that kind of depend on those things having a convention.
Nice.
So not everything builds on top of the other thing. So it's all like really little libraries that end up building bigger things. And then what we're trying to do then is the ultimate goal is like Chris was saying, like the panacea, I guess, would be, hey, everybody uses tracing because it gives you more insight. But there's like a large lift today in Erlang and Elixir to do that. Like it's a lot of work, and we're trying to build all the tools to make it more accessible. And open telemetry really fits big in there too, because then it also doesn't lock you into a vendor. And now all of your code is like completely agnostically instrumented, and you can just kind of pick where do you want to go.
Nice.
Thank you
Very
for
cool.
mentioning that. I was going to ask how this might relate to like telemetry as a concept or open telemetry. Like the talk title is what drew me in because I'm new to telemetry as a concept, right? And so I don't know how Elixir telemetry ties into the idea of telemetry as a whole because I'm new to trying to add spans and events into applications at all. Right?
yeah. So, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I think like the cool thing is we could support the open telemetry via all the telemetry events that sort of already exist, and also service all these other needs as well, which is really cool. So yeah, like we're looking into swapping out some of our stuff, or like we've looked into it before with swapping out stuff for like open telemetry, and it would be a matter of just changing like our library that we wrote essentially to do that instead of doing like the Datadog thing.
But open telemetry is a much bigger thing than like the telemetry project in the Beam. There's like some effort there to like plug telemetry into open telemetry, but open telemetry itself offers a whole bunch of other stuff. Its like scope is way broader.
It's also like driven by Go, and then like it has APIs that you have to implement that are all driven by Go, which means they're all like written in Go.
Are you trying to imply something about Go, perhaps?
I mean, I've attempted to read the open telemetry spec like 4 times, and I actually can't do it. Like my brain just like shuts down at like paragraph 25 that shows yet another like imperative API that's written in Go. And you have to do all and I'm just like, God, you gotta be kidding me. Like none of this makes sense. Like, how do you people live your lives this way?
The tone that you use when you say the word go is like really resonating with me right now.
I was just going to say the emphasis when go is said is amazing.
Go puts the go and go away.
Yeah, if you do want to see like in practice, like why we've done the things that we've done with telemetry to try and get these conventions, if you go to open telemetry and you look at all the libraries we've been releasing, like, so they're all highly dependent. They're 100% dependent essentially on those events. So we're able to like automatically instrument Phoenix and Ecto and things like that by having those conventions. if we didn't have them, then we couldn't give you stuff that you could just drop in and say like, oh, I want to use Phoenix with OpenTelemetry. There is a bridge library that's not released. It's private still, but it essentially works off of telemetry registry to do automatic wiring up of discovering of every spannable thing that's in your applications to OpenTelemetry.
Hi, I'm Scott. I had a question I put in the chat because it includes a link to the telemetry metrics StatsD documentation. And I don't know if it's StatsD specific or what, but documentation here and other places defines a counter with the name either in the list of atoms form or in string form with a suffix of the word counter. But then the examples also use examples of the execute call that doesn't use the suffix. And like, what the hell's up with that?
I'm going to make someone else answer this because I don't use this thing. So to be clear, I just use statics directly.
I read it enough to decide why I wasn't going to use it. And essentially it's because it's kind of what you're talking about there, Scott, where it's this misleading or kind of confusing thing. And what you're looking at is kind of a DSL that someone wrote around working with telemetry events. So that counter function that you're talking about takes the last key that you include right there. So you did like db.query.count, and that tells it what it should bump in statsd, and all the stuff before that is then the event. And so that's why you see the like db.query.count and their usage of counter DSL, but not in the telemetry.execute.
Can I take a straw poll real quick? Everybody here that understands like how that works, that's figured it out. How many of you hate it? And how many of you like it?
Well, I'm hating it at the moment, but I don't know what the hell I'm doing. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I refuse to answer such a leading question.
I wouldn't say I hate it. Yeah. I just hate how non-obvious it is to figure out how it fits together.
Okay.
I'll also say that I'm like supposedly sort of an expert in this area, and I just lost interest while Matt was explaining all that stuff. Like I just like that annoying to me.
Yeah, I'd really suggest like just using the base telemetry library and then ignoring every other library that's been created in the ecosystem, honestly.
So I should be rolling my own statsd sending client library goop and ignore existing practice.
I mean, like it's happily not even a client. There's a statics as a library in Elixir, and you just add that library, and then you can hook into whatever events you're interested in yourself, and then you can do statics.increment my event or whatever for sure, and just say yourself what events you want incremented or histogrammed or counted, as opposed to trying to figure out this DSL and hoping that whoever comes in behind you can also figure out that DSL and maintain what you wrote. I recently had someone come in and suggest replacing all of our custom statsd telemetry stuff with this DSL, and he wrote out the entire spec, and it just came down to replace this, we'd introduce 4 new dependencies and have a DSL, or we could just stick with the straight up statics.increment calls ourselves. And I had a hard time being convinced that 4 new dependencies was a good idea at a DSL. That's the end of my rant.
But if you use it, then you get to use the Phoenix Live dashboard, Matt.
Yeah, right. So that's the one place that I've seen it used, and it's because they just have a generator that does it all for you. And that's also the only place I've ever seen someone want to use it. Yeah.
But also, we can fix the telemetry metrics statsd thing. I wasn't clear on what the actual problem was myself.
Yeah, so the complaint is actually with the shortcut telemetry metrics magic on the name.
Yeah, if there's magic
involved. For the record, I've been trying to introduce a breaking change to get rid of that because it is very not obvious. So I'll tell you what, I will create the issue for you because I want it gone. And everybody can come in and thumbs up it.
That sounds about like
how's that sound?
Basically been happening. Either Brian messages me a link to an issue. He's like, "Go thumbs up this and pile on, please," or Matt will link me an issue and be like, "Go thumbs up and pile on this, please." And then
that has never happened. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And this is the means by which we get the wheels to roll. It's not a good engine or an efficient engine or a very nice engine, but it is an engine.
So I will make a counter argument case for metrics, and one of those reasons is that like at larger companies, if you have more stuff, right? So I'm at Simple Bet now. We will probably be releasing what our internal tool is. It's very similar to Hertz. One of the things is that when you have a lot of services and you have a larger organization, standardization and what is automatic across your services becomes a lot more important. Like every single service should record our durations and milliseconds, right? Like, and the name should be the same. So building these tools out, like adding the metric, essentially you're adding the metric definitions and other things in this one drop-in. And so it can be many small libraries that make up that one, but then in your organization, ideally, it's the same thing that like Bleacher Report has done, which is I drop in our monitoring tool and just tell it which things I'm using, and then everything is just kind of automatically wired up for you. So it condenses it all in one spot, and then it makes it really simple to say like, all right, we're moving from StatsD to Prometheus. And in that case, we're just switching a reporter out versus having to re-instrument our entire code base across the entire company. So that's the promise of where it becomes something that you probably want to adopt versus wiring all your own stuff up.